You hear the crackling first sharp and hollow, like firewood snapping in a cold wind. Then you see them, rows and rows of them stretching into the fog. Not trees, not banners, bodies, perched on wooden stakes that tower above you like silent sentinels. Some still twitch, others hang limp, their skin gray in the morning light. The air is thick with the smell of decay and smoke. And as you stand frozen at the edge of this forest of the dead, you realize this was not a battlefield. This was a message. Before we go any further, I'd love to... Nowhere in the world are you watching from. It amazes me every time that a story this dark, this old, still finds its way to screens across every continent. This was Wallachia in the summer of 1462, and the man who created this nightmare wasn't a monster from folklore. He was a prince, a Christian ruler, a military strategist whose name would echo through centuries, not because he conquered empires, but because he perfected the art of terror. His name was Vlad III, but history would remember him as Vlad Vlad the Impaler. And what he did to his enemies, what you're about to hear, will make you question where the line between justice and monstrosity truly lies. The year before this forest of stakes appeared, Vlad had reclaimed his throne in Wallachia, a small principality wedged between the Hungarian kingdom and the Ottoman Empire. It was a land constantly torn apart by outside powers, its rulers assassinated or replaced like pieces on a chessboard. Vlad's own father had been murdered. His older brother, Mircea, was buried alive by Wallachian nobles who feared his loyalty to the Ottomans. Vlad himself had been held hostage in the Ottoman capital as a boy insurance for his father's loyalty. He learned their language, he studied their military tactics, and he learned how to hate. When he returned to power in 1456, Vlad inherited a fractured, bleeding country. Bojars, the local nobility, had grown fat on corruption and treachery. Merchants swindled travelers. Ottoman raiders swept through villages unopposed, dragging away children to be sold in distant markets. Wallachia was not a kingdom, it was a wound, and Vlad believed that only fire could cauterize it. According to Saxon chronicles written by merchants who lived through his reign, Vlad's first act as prince was to invite the Bojars, who had killed his family, to a feast. They came dressed in silk and velvet, expecting favor. Instead, Vlad's guards seized them. The older nobles were impaled on stakes outside the palace. The younger ones were forced to march 50 miles through the mountains to rebuild a crumbling fortress Ponari castle stone by stone until their fine clothes fell away in tatters and their hands bled into the mortar. This was not revenge for its own sake. This was a declaration. A new order had begun, and disobedience would not be tolerated. But Vlad's cruelty wasn't random. It followed a cold, disciplined logic. He believed that fear-deep, absolute, inescapable fear was the only language that could unite a broken people and hold back an empire. And soon that empire came calling. In the spring of 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had shattered the walls of Constantinople just 9 years earlier, assembled an army of nearly 90,000 men. His target, Wallachia. His goal, to crush Vlad and install a more obedient ruler. Mehmed expected resistance. What he found was something far worse. As the Ottoman forces crossed the Danube and pushed into Wallachian territory, they entered a land that had been deliberately destroyed. Entire villages stood empty, their homes reduced to blackened frames. Wells had been poisoned with lime and dead animals. Crops were burned in the fields. Livestock gone. Even the people had vanished, evacuated or slaughtered to ensure the Ottomans would find no guides, no informants, no mercy. This was scorched earth warfare, and Vlad executed it with ruthless precision. In a letter he sent to his ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Vlad described his own actions without remorse. "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young. We have burned down everything." The letter, preserved in the Hungarian National Archives, is written in a bureaucratic tone almost clinical. There is no pride in it, no guilt, just fact. Vlad's army numbered fewer than 30,000 men. He could not win a direct battle, so he turned his homeland into a weapon. Every step the Ottomans took deeper into Wallachia brought them closer to starvation, disease, and madness. Ottoman soldiers began falling ill within days. Dysentery swept through the camps. The water they found was foul. The few villages that still stood were empty shells, their granaries burned, their wells filled with rotting corpses. Scouts sent ahead to find supplies never returned. Those who did come back told stories of ambushes in the night. Wallachian cavalry appearing like ghosts, slaughtering sentries, then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Mehmed's generals advised caution. But the Sultan pressed forward. He had conquered the greatest city in Christendom. He would not be turned back by a minor prince with a small army. But the real horror was still ahead. As Mehmed's forces approached the Wallachian capital of Targovik in June, scouts reported something strange on the horizon. At first, they thought it was a forest, but forests don't appear overnight, and forests don't smell like that. When the vanguard arrived, they stopped. Before them, stretching for nearly a mile in every direction, was a field of stakes. On each stake, a body. Some were Ottoman soldiers captured in earlier skirmishes. Others were Wallachian villagers accused of collaborating with the enemy. There were men, women, even children. Some had been dead for weeks, their flesh blackened and peeling. Others were fresher, still recognizable. The stakes were arranged in concentric circles, carefully organized by height and position or grotesque architecture of death. This was the forest of the impaled, and it was waiting for the Sultan. Ottoman chronicler Tursun Bey, who was present during the campaign, recorded the moment Mehmed II entered the field. The Sultan, a man who had watched the fall of empires and ordered the executions of thousands, reportedly went pale. He dismounted from his horse and walked among the stakes in silence. His officers stood frozen. Soldiers whispered prayers. Some vomited. Others refused to look. According to Tursun Bey's account, there were approximately 20,000 bodies in that field. 20,000, each one a person who had lived, breathed, feared, and died in agony. Each one positioned deliberately to create maximum psychological impact. Near the center of the forest, on the tallest stake, hung the body of Hamza Pasha, one of Mehmed's most trusted commanders, captured weeks earlier in a skirmish. He had been dressed in his finest robes before being impaled. The fabric was now stained and torn, but still recognizable. It was a message within a message. Not even your best will be spared. Mehmed reportedly said, "A man who does such things is not to be trifled with. He is either very brave or very mad." But Vlad was neither. He was strategic, because the bodies on those stakes weren't just victims, they were arguments. Each one said, "This is what happens to those who invade. This is what happens to those who betray. This is what I am willing to do." And the message worked. According to multiple sources, including Greek historian Lanikos Chalkokondyles, Mehmed's army began to fracture. Morale collapsed. Disease spread. Supplies ran low. Soldiers began deserting under cover of darkness. Preferring to risk execution for abandoning their posts, rather than continue deeper into this cursed land. The Sultan, facing mounting losses and an enemy he could not see, made a decision that must have tasted like poison. He ordered a retreat. The conqueror of Constantinople turned back, leaving Wallachia to the Empire. It was an astonishing victory. A tiny principality had forced the most powerful empire in the world to withdraw. But the cost moral, human spiritual, was incalculable. But Vlad didn't stop at impalement. He refined cruelty into an art form. There's a story recorded in both Slavic and Saxon sources about two Ottoman envoys sent by Mehmed to negotiate before the invasion. When they entered Vlad's court, they kept their turbans and a sign of respect in their culture, but a breach of protocol in Vlad's eyes. He asked them why they would not remove their headwear. They replied that it was their custom, their faith. Vlad nodded. Then he said, "Then let them be fastened forever, in honor of your devotion." He ordered his guards to nail the turbans to their skulls with iron spikes. Then he had them impaled and displayed at the city gates. This story, whether fully accurate or embellished over time, reveals something essential about Vlad. He didn't just kill, he staged death. Every execution was a performance, calculated to communicate power, discipline, and inevitability. The envoys' bodies remained at the gates for weeks, visible to every traveler entering the capital. They became landmarks. Directions were given in relation to them. And sometimes he didn't kill at all. Sometimes he sent them home. Among the most chilling tactics Vlad employed was the deliberate mutilation and release of Ottoman captives. According to the Skazanio Dracula Vovada, 15th century Slavic chronicle, Vlad would capture enemy soldiers, blind them, sever their noses or ears, and then release them to walk back to their own camps. They were not prisoners of war, they were living warnings. Imagine being a soldier in Mem's army. You watch your comrades march into the forest. Days later, they return barely. Their faces are ruined. They cannot see. They cannot speak clearly. But they can tell you, in broken whispers, what waits ahead. This was psychological warfare at its most intimate. Vlad understood that fear spreads faster than fire, and a man who has seen horror will carry it with him, infecting everyone he meets. Some of these mutilated survivors were high-ranking officers, men who had commanded hundreds, who had fought in the siege of Constantinople, who had seen the worst that warfare could offer. And yet they stumbled back to their camps, trembling, broken, begging their sultan to turn back. The scars they carried were not just physical. Ottoman records from the period mentioned soldiers who refused to sleep, who screamed at shadows, who could no longer hold weapons without shaking. Today, we might call it post-traumatic stress. In 1462, they simply called it the Mark of the Impaler. One account describes a group of 50 Ottoman prisoners who were blinded and then linked together by rope, all but one. That man was left with one eye just enough to lead the others back to Membes camp. They walked for 3 days through the burned countryside, stumbling over corpses and through ashes until they reached Ottoman lines. The last thing that one-eyed man saw before Vlad's soldiers took his remaining eye was the look of horror on his comrades' faces when they heard what had happened. But why? Why go this far? Some historians argue Vlad was a sadist, a tyrant drunk on power. Others say he was a patriot, a man willing to become a devil to protect his people from a greater evil. The truth is probably both, and neither. Vlad lived in a world where mercy was seen as weakness, where compromise meant extinction. His father had tried diplomacy and was betrayed. His brother had tried loyalty and was buried alive. Vlad chose a different path. He chose to become so terrifying that no one noble, merchant, or sultan would dare challenge him. And for a time, it worked. Crime in Wallachia reportedly dropped to almost nothing. Merchants could leave gold in the streets and return to find it untouched. Foreign travelers wrote that Vlad's Wallachia was the safest place in Eastern Europe. As long as you obeyed the law, break it, and you became part of the message. There's a legend recorded in multiple chronicles about a golden cup that Vlad placed at a public fountain in Turgovect. Anyone could drink from it, but no one could steal it. The cup remained there throughout Vlad's reign, untouched, because everyone knew what would happen to a thief. Was this justice? Or was it terror disguised as order? The line between the two became increasingly blurred. According to the German pamphlets published after his death propaganda pieces, but based on real events, Vlad once invited beggars and the sick to a great feast. He fed them lavishly, gave them wine, asked if they wanted for anything. When they said no, that they were content, he had the hall locked and set on fire. Everyone inside burned to death. When his advisors asked why, Vlad reportedly said, "I have freed them from their misery. Now they will never hunger again." This story may be exaggerated, but the fact that it was believable that people who knew Vlad could imagine him doing this tells you everything you need to know about how he was perceived. Another chronicle records an incident involving a foreign merchant who complained that his cart had been robbed on the road to Targovik. Vlad asked him to describe what was stolen and how much it was worth. The merchant listed his losses. Vlad ordered his soldiers to find the thief, and within hours, the stolen goods were returned along with an extra gold coin. The merchant, being honest, pointed out the extra coin. Vlad smiled and said, "If you had kept it, you would have joined the thief on a stake outside the city." The thief was impaled that evening. The merchant left Wallachia the next morning and never returned. He had become the thing he set out to create, a living embodiment of fear. But terror, no matter how effective, cannot last forever. In 1462, after Mem's retreat, Vlad's Hungarian allies grew wary. King Matthias, fearing Vlad's growing power and influenced by rival Bojars who had fled to Hungary, had him arrested on fabricated charges including accusations that he had secretly negotiated with the Ottomans, the very enemy he had just defeated. Vlad spent the next 12 years imprisoned in Hungary, watching from behind bars as his country fell back into chaos. During those years, Vlad reportedly converted to Catholicism, married into Hungarian nobility, and lived in a comfortable house in Pest. He was given relative freedom. Some historians believe he was relieved to be away from Wallachia, exhausted by the weight of what he had done. Others say he spent every day planning his return. When he was finally released and returned to Wallachia in 1476, he found his country had moved on. The nobles he had terrorized were back in power. The people no longer feared him. Some didn't even remember him. He was a ghost trying to reclaim a throne that no longer existed. Within months, Vlad was ambushed and killed by unknown assassins, possibly Ottoman agents, possibly rival Bojars, possibly his own men, who saw him as a relic of a brutal past. His head was severed and sent to the new sultan as proof of his death. His body was buried somewhere in the forests near Snagov Monastery, in an unmarked grave that has never been definitively found. But even in death, Vlad could not escape his legend. In the centuries after his death, Vlad's reputation refused to settle into a single shape. Across Europe, his story fractured into competing myths. In German lands, cheap printed pamphlets reveled in gore, turning him into a grotesque spectacle meant to shock and sell. In Slavic chronicles, he became a warning proof of how absolute power corrodes the soul. In Romanian memory, however, he endured as something far more complicated, a ruler forged in invasion and betrayal, who chose terror as his shield and paid for it with his humanity. Then literature sealed his fate. When Bram Stoker borrowed the name Dracula, the transformation was complete. The historical prince who used fear as a weapon became an immortal predator who fed on blood itself. Vlad achieved the immortality he sought, but only as a monster of fiction. The world remembers the vampire more vividly than the voivode, yet the real Vlad Gapek exists in the uncomfortable space between legend and reality. He was not madness incarnate, nor was he a simple patriot hero. He was a man shaped by siege, hostage-taking and constant war, someone who convinced himself that mercy was weakness, that cruelty was clarity, and that terror could be a form of order. He believed, with chilling sincerity, that becoming inhuman was the price of survival. Modern Romania still grapples with that legacy. His face adorns statues and souvenirs. His name is taught with pride. Visitors climb the ruins of Poneri Castle, breathless from the ascent, and hear stories of defiance and resolve. But the stones tell another story of forced labor, broken bodies, and fear baked into the walls. The mountains keep both truths. The forests of stakes are gone. The screams have faded. Life has reclaimed the land. Yet Vlad's question lingers, heavy in the cold air of the Carpathians, when survival demands brutality. Where is the line between protector and monster? And who gets to decide when that line has been crossed? History answered by refusing to choose. Vlad is remembered as both savior and butcher, hero and demon. The stakes have rotted away, but the shadow they cast still stretches across centuries, reminding us that power, once justified by fear, never stops demanding a price.